There was also the suggestion that Indonesia could play some sort of mediating role to help end the war between Russia and Ukraine.
Взагалі, це є така велика проблема, коли ми говоримо говоримо третьому світу, говоримо цим країнам про обставини цієї війни, то дуже часто вони не розуміють, вони перебувають в полоні тих наративів, які були поширені в часи Холодної війни.
Indonesia presents itself and promotes itself as a middle power, as a potential regional leader, as a leader of ASEAN and a potential Muslim world leader.
Hello and welcome to Ukraine in Flames, a special project by Ukraine Media Center and NGO Euro-Atlantic Course. My name is Alexandra Tsikhanovska, and today we talk about Indonesia. If you want to know why do we discuss the country so far away, both from Ukraine and Russia, subscribe to our channel to stay tuned. On June 29th, the president of Indonesia, Joko Vidodo, visited Ukraine for the first time since the large-scale invasion and met with his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky. This visit was followed by a flight to Moscow on July the 4th, where Mr. Vidodo met Vladimir Putin. Indonesia has rather timidly, perhaps, although that's to be evaluated, tried to position itself as a mediator between both sides. How effective can such mediating efforts be, and how likely is Indonesia to succeed? How much experience as a peace negotiator does it have? And finally, how willing is Russia to not just talk the talk about peace, but also walk the walk? Spoiler, not really. So we turn to Dr. Nigel Gould-Davies, Senior Fellow at International Institute for Strategic Studies for answers.
So President Jokowi of Indonesia recently visited Kyiv and Moscow, primarily in connection with Indonesia's chairing of the G20. There was also the suggestion that Indonesia could play some sort of mediating role to help end the war between Russia and Ukraine. I think this is very unlikely to succeed, partly because Indonesia has no substantive experience in mediating major conflicts like this. And in addition, I don't see any appetite or interest in Moscow in ending the war. On the contrary, I think everything that we've seen and heard suggests that Putin has not abandoned his original and primary goal of subordinating the whole of Ukraine and imposing some sort of puppet regime in Kyiv. And he and people around him have, in effect, restated that in recent days. Nonetheless, it was an opportunity for Moscow also to get out its disinformation and its narratives about responsibility for the commodity price inflation that's now affecting more and more economies and putting societies under strain. In effect, trying to blame the West rather than accept responsibility for its own blockading of Ukrainian ports and stealing of Ukraine's grain. And this also follows the recent visit by the African Union chair, Macky Sall, to Moscow, where Russia tried to spin a similar line. And also consistent with what we've seen Putin say at the St. Petersburg summit about reaching out and engaging more fully with non-Western economic partners. Of course, we will now await the November summit of the G20 in Bali. And it's worth remembering how Foreign Minister Lavrov was received at the G20 ministerial just last week. In effect, he found himself isolated. The 19 other countries present showed no sympathy for the Russian point of view, and Lavrov understood this and walked out early. I think Putin, if he's able to attend the Bali summit, is likely to receive similar treatment. I see no fundamental movement towards understanding his point of view at this point. Could the summit itself serve as a basis for substantive peace talks and progress towards a resolution of the conflict? Well, that really depends on what Russia wants as much as anything. And again, it would require Russia to fundamentally scale back its objectives. That will only happen, I think, if both the military costs on the ground in Ukraine and the economic costs that I believe sanctions will increasingly impose on the Russian economy would cause a fundamental reappraisal in Moscow and lead Putin to the conclusion that it's more risky to continue the war than to allow an end to it. We're not at that point yet, but we have several months between now and November, so let's see. Finally, Southeast Asian countries, as with Asia more generally, is deeply concerned about the war. And this was made very clear at the recent Shangri-La summit last month in Singapore. Very strikingly, almost all of the Asian defense ministers who spoke mentioned the war, and they expressed three concerns. One is that the challenge to the rules-based order and the violation of basic norms of sovereignty in one part of the world could weaken them elsewhere, and of course, particularly in Asia. The second concern was that the Russian invasion of Ukraine could serve as a precedent for Chinese aggression against Taiwan. And the third concern, most immediate and direct, is the effect on commodity prices, particularly on energy and grain, that this war is producing as a consequence of Russia's actions. So this is a global issue and a global concern. It's felt in Asia, and they will continue to watch very closely as events develop.
So regional food security is Indonesia's first and foremost important concern, and this is something that we should all understand. It was key emphasis of Widodo's press addresses both in Kyiv and in Moscow. So how can we really evaluate the visit of the Indonesian president to Russia, and can it be considered a mediatory mission in the first place? How is this linked to the upcoming G20 meeting to be held in Bali in November 2022? We decided to discuss these very important issues once more with Igor Semyvolos, Executive Director of Association of Middle East Studies.
Індонезія є країною-господарем зустрічі, яка G20, тобто 20 найбільших економік світу, яка відбудеться восени цього року. В рамках цієї зустрічі передбачається участь віртуальна або невіртуальна Путіна і Зеленського. Про Зеленського вже це домовлено, про Путіна також існують домовленості, але не зрозуміло, в якому вигляді він буде присутній там. Його візит – це частина підготовки до цієї зустрічі. І важко, напевно, назвати посередницькою місією, тут скоріше зондування позицій для того, щоб зрозуміти, як взагалі, про що можна буде в рамках цієї зустрічі говорити щодо Росії і України. Ми бачили перед підготовку до цього саміту, ми бачили у вигляді зустрічі міністра закордонних справ. І ми бачили обструкцію, яка була здійснена Лаврову в рамках цієї зустрічі. І це, так би мовити, свідчить про ту напругу, яка існує в рамках цієї організації, цього клубу, щодо майбутньої зустрічі в листопаді. Ясна річ, що коли ми говоримо про можливість зустрічі або проведення якихось консультацій з участю лідерів, які ворогують між собою і які ведуть війну безпрецедентну з часів Другої світової війни, то дуже важко уявити собі теми і обставини, в яких можливий продуктивний діалог. Особливо, коли мова йде не про підготовлені якісь теми, а от просто про спонтанні, тобто, власне, так, як воно відбувається, тобто, де обговорюються глобальні теми, і українське або російської агресії проти України може бути серед інших тем, які обговорюються на саміті. І от ця обставина, вона створює навколо цього саміту дуже велику нервозність, дуже велике напруження. І, очевидно, є великі побоювання, що насправді це може призвести до скасування частини з програми, або, скажімо, переформатування цього саміту, або відтермінування саміту. Тобто, іншими словами, існує дуже багато різних таких нюансів, непередбачуваних, здебільшого, які можуть ускладнити проведення цієї зустрічі. Справа в тім, що Радянський Союз і Росія сприймалися в цьому регіоні не як імперіалістична країна. І тому у них немає тих асоціацій з Росією, як з імперіалістичною країною. Взагалі, це є така велика проблема, коли ми говоримо третьому світу, говоримо цим країнам про обставини цієї війни, то дуже часто вони не розуміють, вони перебувають в полоні тих наративів, які були поширені в часи Холодної війни, де ворогом були Сполучені Штати Америки, подекуди Китай, але ніколи не Радянський Союз. І Радянський Союз, оскільки він не сприймався як імперія, то антиколоніальний наратив, який в даному випадку є абсолютно притаманний в цій ситуації, в якій ми опинилися, тобто ми справді ведемо антиколоніальну війну, він не зчитується цими країнами. І тут дуже багато треба зробити для того, щоб вони побачили дотичність нашого кейсу з їхніми справами. Тому поки що з цим важко. Вони обмежуються лише такими, знаєте, традиційними заклинаннями в вигляді глибокого занепокоєння і запевненнями, що, звісно, мир краще війни. Але намагаються триматися осторонь і не створювати суб'єктність в цій війні, тобто не виступати на якомусь боці.
So evidently, Indonesia is heavily invested in ensuring that the G20 meeting is a success. What other ambitions does the state have, and how do they influence Indonesian position on the Russian war against Ukraine? Let's find out with Alina Hrytsenko, a senior consultant at National Institute for Strategic Studies.
So Indonesia presents itself and promotes itself as a middle power, as a potential regional leader, as a leader of ASEAN and a potential Muslim world leader, because Indonesia is a rapidly growing economy, a fast-growing population, and moreover, the biggest Muslim population in the world. And all those achievements suggest to have a corresponding political status, which is Indonesia is currently trying to achieve. And due to the current Indonesia's G20 presidency, is a great opportunity for Indonesia to pursue those interests and pursue those ambitions and to establish itself as a middle power and as a leader. And due to that fact, of course, a leader cannot ignore a large-scale damaging war happening in Europe, which also causes and has negative impact on all the countries all over the world and Indonesia itself, because of the skyrocketing prices of food, of fuel, of fertilizers, which affects Indonesia also. So Joko Vidodo, as a president of Indonesia, decided to use this opportunity and to present the country as a potential mediator or intermediary in the conflicts. Joko Vidodo also became the first Asian leader to visit Ukraine and to visit Kyiv since the outbreak of war. And Joko Vidodo also had negotiations both with President Zelensky and President Putin. But the main goal of those negotiations for Indonesia was, of course, not to end the war, because it is impossible due to natural geopolitical reasons, but to mitigate this negative impact the war has all over the world. So the main topics Joko Vidodo discussed with Ukrainian and the Russian president or presidents was firstly to deblock the Ukrainian ports to provide unhindered transportation of Ukrainian wheat. Ukraine has been the biggest supplier of wheat to Indonesia, and also to provide fertilizer supply. But if it's has to be said that President Zelensky and President Putin both were invited to G20 summit, which is about to happen in November in Bali, Indonesia. However, it is not yet clear if President Putin is going to attend the summit. But nevertheless, G20 summit is hardly to become that peace-building platform, because G20 is an organization that addresses global economy issues, digital economy issues, and of course, ecological issues, but not geopolitical or war or weapons or peace-building issues. But it has to be said that Indonesia is quite impartial and quite indifferent in this country, in this conflict, but just like all the other Southeast countries. And this is due to the fact that, firstly, those countries are located far away from Ukraine. We do not share any common history, any common interests. So for Southeast Asia countries, it is quite not clear about the essence of the conflict that is happening between Ukraine and Russia. And still there is such a they perceive Russia as still a potential USSR empire. They still remember those times of the Cold War. In Southeast Asia, they like this style of leadership, like Joko Vidodo has, President Putin has, this macho, strong style of leadership. And Ukraine, unfortunately, is not well presented in those countries. Ukraine does not have a certain strong image as a country in that region of the world, in those in Southeast Asia. And still there is a lot of anti-Western and anti-American attitudes in that part of the world. And Ukraine is perceived as a regional country that lacks some sort of political will to make its own foreign policy decisions. But it's treated as a country that it listens to some sort of instructions and consultations from the White House. So for that reason, those countries in that part of the world in Southeast Asia remain neutral and somehow impartial in the conflict.
Promoting and securing Indonesian role as a regional leader to a large extent means dealing with the food crisis that will hit Asia hard. Our next guest, an Asia-focused expert on international relations, Natalia Butyrska, will tell us more about this factor that we have already established as a very important one. And she will also discuss other issues of importance, such as the role of political tradition in the country and its impact on the international diplomacy of Indonesia.
The warning of food crisis and the attempt to save the G20 summit this autumn forced Indonesia President Joko Vidodo to engage in global diplomacy. Recently, he completed the European tour in which he took part in the G7 summit and also visited Kyiv and Moscow. Expectations that the visit of the Indonesian president would significantly improve the development of Russian-Ukrainian relations were low. Joko Vidodo has been focused more on his country's economic issues than foreign policy, and Indonesia has a rather limited experience of mediation outside of Southeast Asia. Indonesia's chairmanship at the G20 summit became an important event in Widodo's presidency and should contribute to increasing the country's investment attractiveness. Russia's aggression against Ukraine complicated the situation for the Indonesia officials. The president of Indonesia invited Putin to participate at the summit last spring. Western countries called for the withdrawal of this invitation. However, Jokowi ignored requests from Western leaders to withdraw Putin's invitation, even under the threat of the boycott. Instead, he invited the Ukrainian president. The invitation of the Ukrainian president was a manifestation of so-called balanced approach to the conflict, because Ukraine is not part of the group of 20. So Indonesia tried to illustrate that it is ready to take into account the interest of the West, but at the same time seeks to maintain good relations with Russia. The tradition of neutrality and non-alignment forces the country's government to balance between the West and Russia. Today, there is a high probability that Putin will participate in the conference virtually, and this will reduce the risk of the boycott of the summit by representatives of the other G20 countries. In the conditions of war, the physical presence of President Zelensky is also unlikely. Therefore, the summit in Bali excludes the possibility of personal peace talks between President Putin and President Zelensky. In addition, Russia's behavior does not imply a desire to conduct a peaceful dialogue. The Russian-Ukrainian war seriously affects the agenda of the summit and reduces the level of interaction of its participants in finding solutions to global problems. Russia, as one of the members, has closely violated the main values that underline the current international order and the spirit of cooperation of the group of the 20 itself. Russia not only violated the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, but also uses energy resources and food products as means of blackmail against the whole world. This led to serious economic consequences in the world. Since the beginning of the war, prices of raw materials, energy resources, and food have increased. This can provoke world hunger and lead to growing dissatisfaction among the population in many countries in the world. Before the start of his visit to Europe, President Vidodo emphasized that his visit is important not only for Indonesia, but also for all developing and poor countries. During the meeting with Putin, he focused on solving the food crisis caused by the war. Indonesia is the world's second largest importer of Ukrainian grains. The country also depends on the supply of mineral fertilizers and other agricultural products imported Russia and Ukraine, as other countries in Southeast Asia. From the point of view of peacemaking efforts, Vidodo's visit to Kyiv and Moscow did not play a significant role. However, if international community succeeds in unblocking Ukrainian ports with grain, the Indonesian president will be able to highlight his benefit in his progress as well. Joko Vidodo appeared to be the first Asia leader to visit Kyiv and Moscow after the start of the Russian-Ukrainian war. This became a manifestation of the region's attention to the situation in Ukraine, especially if we take into account that next year Indonesia will proceed over ASEAN. At the same time, from the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the reaction of ASEAN as an influential regional organization in Southeast Asia was quite weak and limited to a call for diplomatic means and a peaceful settlement. This is not surprising, given the lack of consensus among the 10 member states which reacted differently to Russian aggression. For example, Singapore took the strongest position and imposed anti-Russia sanctions. Myanmar supported the Kremlin's actions, and the rest of the countries are trying to maintain neutrality. Also, the reaction of the Russian Federation violates international law and the principles of the UN, which are sensitive to these countries. It also creates a precedent for more aggressive actions by China in the Asia-Pacific. Despite this, the majority of Southeast Asia countries are still not ready to join Western sanctions and diplomatic condemnation of the Russian Federation. They are trying to continue to maintain economic and political relations with Russia. This unfortunately weakens the international isolation of the Russian Federation and the best efforts to punish Russia for its unprovoked aggression against Ukraine.
You've been watching this special project by Ukraine Media Center and NGO Euro-Atlantic Course, Ukraine in Flames. If you find our work useful, please like and share this video and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. In the meantime, in the description to this episode, you can find information on how you personally can help Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. Remember that everything is going to be Ukraine.